She made beautiful dolls that touched hearts, but behind each stitch was a silent cry for help. People often admired the delicate features, the hand-painted eyes, the finely stitched dresses. They would say things like, "This one looks so real," or "There's something magical about these dolls." And there was something magical, something soft and warm, something human, but no one ever asked why they felt that way. No one ever wondered who was really behind those gentle faces. Each doll was made with the kind of care that can't be taught. You could tell someone poured their soul into it, not just skill, but emotion. It wasn't just clothes and paint. It was longing. It was love that had nowhere else to go. Behind those dolls was someone who had spent her life hidden away, told she was broken, told she was unworthy, told she'd never be enough. She was given silence when she needed kindness. She was given pity when she longed for dignity. The world never looked at her as a whole person, only as a girl with a twisted leg, a girl who'd never marry, never dance, never be seen. And so she turned to the one thing no one could control, creation. She started sewing in the quiet hours, away from the judgmental eyes, away from the cruel words. The fabric was soft between her fingers. The thread obeyed her hands. With every stitch, she was building something that was hers. Each doll she made had a face that told a story. Some had eyes full of hope, others had gentle sadness. Each was different, and yet all of them were her. People would buy those dolls and gift them to children, place them on shelves, admire their beauty, but never once guess the truth. That the woman who made them had never been held with the tenderness she gave to her creations. That every brushstroke on those tiny faces came from the ache of not being seen, not being chosen. She didn't speak of her pain. She didn't shout or ask for help. She just kept sewing. She kept giving, because that's what love does, even when it's not returned, even when the world is cold. She gave her love freely, because it was the only thing she had left. And the tragedy is most people never even knew. It's easy to overlook people like her, easy to walk past someone quiet and assume they're fine, easy to believe the ones who smile are not carrying sorrow. But behind every smile she painted on those dolls, there was a piece of her own sadness, a sadness that she thought no one would ever notice or understand. But someone did. Someone looked past the beauty of the dolls and saw the pain in their eyes. Someone realized that these weren't just toys, they were messages. Silent cries for warmth, for connection, for a life beyond four walls. And when that happened, everything changed. Because the truth is, all she ever needed was to be seen. Not as a burden, not as someone to pity, but as a person, a woman with dreams, with tenderness, with love waiting quietly inside her. She gave so much of herself to a world that gave so little back. But the moment someone reached into that silence and held her pain like it mattered, she began to heal. That's why this story isn't just about dolls. It's about all the people who live quietly in the corners of our lives. The ones who never complain, never ask for anything, but carry heavy burdens behind polite smiles. It's about love, not the loud, obvious kind, but the quiet kind that builds slowly in the shadows, waiting for someone to finally say, "I see you." And in that moment, for the first time, she was no longer invisible, because sometimes a single act of understanding can be enough to change everything. A twisted leg and a broken spirit kept her hidden from the world, yet her art spoke louder than words. You see, pain doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. It hides in the small things, in the way someone avoids eye contact, or stays quiet in a room full of noise. And sometimes it hides in the corners of a house behind locked doors, old curtains, and unfinished dreams. That's where she lived, not just physically, but emotionally, out of sight, out of reach. Her leg was twisted, yes, but that wasn't what truly broke her. What broke her was the constant reminder that she was somehow less. That no matter how much beauty she had within her, the world would always measure her by what she couldn't do, where she couldn't go, and who she couldn't be. And so she stopped trying. She stayed indoors. She avoided mirrors. She believed the words that were spoken about her, that no one would ever love her, that she'd never build a life of her own. Day by day, she shrank a little more, until her life was reduced to a single chair by the window, and the quiet company of fabric and thread. But here's what the world never saw. While her voice was silenced, her hands were speaking loudly, boldly, through her art, through every single doll she created. Those dolls weren't just toys, they were reflections of something deeper. She couldn't walk freely, but her imagination did. She couldn't speak freely, but her creations told stories she didn't dare say out loud. Some of the dolls had eyes filled with hope. Others held a sadness so real you could feel it just by looking. Their clothes were sewn with care, colors chosen like poetry. They had expressions that made people pause, made them feel, and that's the thing the world couldn't hear her voice, but they felt her through those dolls. Her art was her rebellion. It was her way of saying, I'm still here. I still matter. Without stepping outside, she managed to leave something behind in every home where one of her dolls ended up. She became part of other people's stories, children who played with her dolls, parents who bought them as gifts, strangers who admired them in shop windows. They didn't know her name, didn't know her face, but they carried a piece of her soul without even realizing it. That's what made her special. That's what gave her power, even when everything else in her life had been taken from her. But still, she didn't see it that way. To her, the dolls were a distraction. A way to pass the time, to keep her mind off the pain, to stop herself from remembering all the things she'd been told she couldn't have. Love, a family, a future. It never crossed her mind that what she was creating was beautiful, not just because of how it looked, but because of what it came from. Pain transformed into art, silence turned into connection. She didn't think of herself as strong. But anyone who saw her work would have disagreed. You could look at one of her dolls and somehow feel less alone. That's not something you can teach. That's not something you can fake. It comes from living a life where you've known real sadness and still, somehow, choosing to create beauty. She didn't speak much. She didn't need to. Her art did the speaking. It reached into hearts. It made people stop and think. And for someone who believed she had no voice, no value that's more powerful than she ever imagined. A twisted leg may have kept her from walking freely, but it never stopped her from leaving footprints in quiet rooms, in hearts she never met, and in stories that still live on. And maybe that's the truth we all need to remember. Even the most broken souls can create the most unbreakable beauty. She was told she'd never be loved, never walk again, and never be a mother, but she proved them all wrong. It wasn't just once. It wasn't just one cruel comment in passing. It was repeated, quietly, coldly, and consistently, the kind of message that slowly becomes your reality when you hear it enough times. No man will want you. You're broken. You'll never have a real future. She was just a young girl when those words were first said to her, and over time they became a voice inside her head. She didn't argue, she didn't fight, not at first. She simply accepted it. When people spoke about dreams, she smiled politely, but inside, she didn't see herself in that picture. She had been convinced she wasn't built for those things. Love, family, walking freely under the sun without the weight of pity in people's eyes. Those were luxuries she believed belonged to someone else. Someone whole. Her body was the reason, they said, the twisted leg that kept her from running, from dancing, from appearing normal. But what no one saw was how much more damage had been done to her spirit. Physical pain can be healed. Emotional wounds, the kind made by words that cut deep and never stop echoing, those are harder to fix, especially when they come from someone who should have cared for her. So she stayed quiet, lived in the shadows, sat by the window and watched life happen to other people. While others moved forward, she stitched dolls in a dim room, pouring her silent love into their painted eyes. She watched years pass her by like the seasons outside that same window. But something began to change, not all at once, but slowly in quiet moments. Not because someone told her she was worthy. No, that had never happened. It changed because deep down there was still a part of her that hadn't fully given up. Maybe it was the way her dolls came to life in her hands. Maybe it was the tenderness she still carried, even after years of harshness. Something inside her refused to die. Then came the moment she realized she wasn't invisible, that someone had seen her, not just her pain, not just her limp, but her. Someone had looked past the surface and into the soul of the woman who thought she was unlovable. That changed everything. For the first time, she began to see the lies she'd been told for what they were. Fear, bitterness, control, not truth. She had believed she'd never walk again, but that wasn't true. With the right care, she could heal. She had believed she'd never be loved, but love had found her, not despite who she was, but because of it. And motherhood, that thing she was told she'd never taste, it was closer than she ever imagined. Love entered her life not with grand gestures, but with gentle honesty. It gave her the strength to hope again, to believe again. It wrapped around her the way she once wrapped cloth around her dolls, with purpose, with care, with warmth. And when she finally stood, not just physically but emotionally, she didn't look like the same woman who had once sat by the window hiding her pain. She looked free, and then she became a mother, something that had once felt impossible. Not because of her body, but because the world had told her she wasn't enough. But she was. She always was. And holding her child in her arms, she realized it wasn't strength she lacked, it was belief. And now she had both, so no, she didn't do it out of revenge. She didn't need to prove them wrong out of anger. She simply lived her truth, and that truth was enough. She walked again. She loved deeply. She gave life and received it in return. She became everything she was told she couldn't be. And maybe the most powerful thing about her story isn't that she overcame those words, but that she did it quietly, gently, without shouting. She just became, and in doing so, she silenced every voice that ever said she wouldn't. Every doll she created carried a piece of her soul, a soul waiting to be seen, heard, and loved, and you could feel it. Not in an obvious way, not in something you could point to with your finger, but in a quiet energy the dolls seemed to carry with them. It was something that lingered in the eyes she painted, in the softness of the cheeks she shaped, in the way the small hands were positioned always open, never closed, as if they were waiting to hold something. Or someone. She never said much about herself, not because she didn't have anything to say, but because years of being ignored had taught her not to expect to be heard. So instead, she poured herself into her creations. Every emotion she was too afraid to speak aloud found its way into her work. Her fears, her longings, her loneliness all stitched carefully into dresses and tucked inside the lining of tiny bodies. People saw them as dolls. She knew they were more than that. There's something sacred about making something with your own hands, especially when the world has made you feel like you're not enough. Through those dolls, she was reclaiming a part of herself. She gave them names she never dared to give herself. She gave them eyes that always looked forward, even when she couldn't. And she gave them stories of bravery, of beauty, of quiet strength. It was her way of speaking when her own voice felt too small, her way of asking for love without saying a word. Every time someone bought a doll and said, "This one is special," they had no idea just how true that was. They were holding a piece of her, the parts that had been silenced, hidden, and buried under years of being told she was less. The dolls became her diary, her prayer, her protest. They were messages wrapped in thread and fabric, messages that said, "Please see me, please hear me, please love me for who I am." And the strange thing is, people did feel something. Children loved those dolls more than any others. Adults paused in front of them, touched by something they couldn't explain. That wasn't by accident. That was her soul speaking the only way it knew how. Some dolls were happy, some were quiet. Some had small imperfections, like crooked smiles or mismatched buttons, and yet those were the ones people connected to most. Maybe because they felt real, maybe because they reminded them that imperfection can still be beautiful. She didn't try to make them perfect. She made them honest, and in that honesty, something magical happened. She, who had felt invisible for so long, began to feel seen, not because she forced it, but because her soul couldn't help but reach out. People didn't just see the dolls, they began to see her even if they didn't know it, and for someone who had lived in the background her whole life, that meant more than anything. But even then, she didn't ask for applause. She didn't make her story loud or dramatic. She simply kept doing what she had always done, creating with quiet love, giving parts of herself to a world that had once given her nothing, and slowly that love came back to her. Not in big waves, but in small, tender moments, in the child who clung to her doll every night, in the stranger who left a note saying, "This touched something deep inside me." Through those dolls, she learned she didn't have to shout to be heard. She didn't have to be perfect to be loved. She just had to be real, and that was enough. Because even a soul that's been silenced for years still knows how to speak if you give it a way to be heard. In a world that only saw her weakness, one person saw her worth, and that changed everything. It always felt like she was surrounded by mirrors that only showed her what was broken. Every glance, every whispered comment, every door that never opened, all of it pointed to the same thing, what she lacked, what she wasn't. The world didn't try to understand her, it just defined her. And for a long time she believed it. She believed that her twisted leg was the full story, that her silence meant she had no voice, that her value was measured by her ability to keep up, and since she couldn't, she assumed she had none. She got used to being overlooked. At family gatherings, people talked about her like she wasn't in the room. When strangers came by, their eyes shifted quickly, uncomfortably, as if they didn't know what to say. No one ever asked how she was really doing. No one ever asked what she wanted, or who she dreamed of becoming. So she stopped asking herself those questions too. Life became a pattern of invisibility. She made her dolls, she stayed quiet. She existed, but she didn't live. Then something changed. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It didn't come with fireworks or grand declarations. It started with a conversation, simple, sincere, and unexpected. Someone looked at her and didn't flinch. They didn't rush past her pain or try to fix her with hollow encouragement. They just saw her truly, deeply, not as someone fragile, not as someone to be pitied, but as someone with fire still in her bones. And when you've spent your whole life being defined by what you can't do, there's something radical about someone saying, "You don't have to prove anything. You're enough." At first, she didn't believe it. She waited for the moment it would turn into pity or charity or false hope. But it never did. Instead, that one person kept showing up, not with perfection, but with patience. They asked about her dolls. Not out of politeness, but genuine curiosity. They noticed the smallest details, like the tilt of a doll's head or the way the stitching changed when her mood shifted. They listened when she spoke, even when her words were hesitant and messy. And somehow, they made space for the version of her she didn't even know still existed, the version that dreamed, the version that had something to say, and slowly, something within her began to thaw. She began to speak more not just about the dolls, but about herself, about the pain, about the loneliness, about the soft, fragile hope that maybe she didn't have to carry it all alone. And in return, that one person didn't try to erase her past. They simply stood beside her and reminded her, day after day, that her story wasn't over. There's something powerful about being seen not as a project, not as a burden, but as a person. That's what she had been missing all along. Not a cure, not a miracle, just the dignity of being looked at with eyes that saw her worth instead of her wounds. And when that happened, everything shifted. She began to walk differently, not because her limp disappeared, but because her shame did. She smiled more, not because life was suddenly perfect, but because it finally felt hers. She even began to imagine things she once swore she didn't deserve: love, family, joy. And it wasn't just because someone else believed in her. It was because they helped her believe in herself. That's the real miracle. She became her own voice. She started to dream again, not with fear, but with quiet boldness, and the dolls, they changed too. There was still emotion in their eyes, still honesty in every stitch, but now there was hope, real hope. She once lived in a world that saw only what was missing. But one person, one pair of eyes, one heart that didn't look away reminded her that she was not defined by her weakness. She was not small, she was not invisible, she was and always had been enough. This isn't just a story about dolls, it's a story about healing, hope, and the power of unconditional love. Because if you look closely, if you truly pay attention, you'll realize that those dolls were never just toys. They were symbols, pieces of her past, pieces of her pain, and slowly, pieces of her recovery. Each one was shaped with hands that had once been too afraid to reach out. Each one was stitched in silence, in rooms where words were either too heavy or too hollow to say aloud. But somehow, through them, she found a way to speak. They were tiny messengers of a girl who never felt like she belonged, who never thought she was enough, who spent years hiding in the corners of her own life. But what's remarkable, what still moves me, is that even in those lonely corners, she kept creating. She didn't give up. She made something beautiful out of the very ache that nearly crushed her, and that is what healing looks like. It's quiet, slow, and often invisible to others, but it's real. Hope for her didn't come in loud, dramatic moments. It came in fragile sparks, a doll that turned out better than expected, a stranger who smiled kindly at her, a child who hugged one of her dolls and whispered, "She looks like me," little things, but enough to remind her that maybe her presence mattered, even if the world had once made her feel otherwise. And with every doll, she softened a little. The anger that had grown out of years of feeling forgotten started to melt. The fear that her voice would never matter began to fade. What took its place was gentleness, not weakness, but a quiet kind of strength, the kind that doesn't need to shout, because it knows its own worth. But none of that could have happened without love, and not the kind of love that demands or rescues or tries to fix what it doesn't understand. I'm talking about the kind of love that simply stays, that sits with you when you're at your worst, that listens even when your words are messy, that doesn't look away when the truth is hard. That's what saved her, not a solution, not a hero, just love, soft, patient, unconditional love. That love came into her life slowly, like sunlight finding its way through a thick forest. It didn't try to erase her past. It didn't pretend the pain wasn't there. It just made room for all of it, for her fear, her joy, her creativity, and even her silence. And in that space, she began to grow. She started to laugh again, not the careful, polite kind of laughter that hides sadness, but the deep, full kind that comes when you finally feel safe. She looked at her dolls differently. They no longer just carried sorrow, they carried survival. She even began teaching others how to make them, passing on not just a skill, but a quiet message: you are not alone, because healing is never just personal. Once it starts to grow, it reaches others. The same way her love had once spilled silently into the dolls, now it poured into the people around her, especially the ones who, like her, had been made to feel invisible. And what better proof of hope is there than that? Her story isn't about someone who was rescued. It's about someone who, through love, was reminded of her own power, her own beauty, her own voice. It's about how even the smallest acts of care, a kind word, a shared moment, a doll stitched by trembling hands, can plant seeds of healing in places that have been barren for years. So no, this isn't just a story about dolls. It's a story about a woman who once believed she had nothing to offer and ended up creating something that healed not just herself, but others too. A story about how love doesn't need perfection, it only needs truth. And when love shows up, quietly and consistently, it changes everything. Because sometimes the most broken hearts become the ones that love the deepest. She made dolls, but what she truly stitched was her silent strength. In every thread was pain, in every gaze hope, and in the end love didn't just find her, it made her whole.